Coming up on the next episode of the Next Man Up podcast, Press Play Podcast Network, Kenny Rhoda and I talk about the Browns Steelers aftermath, the Myles Garrett suspension, the pending appeal, and everything pertaining to the Cleveland Browns. Good evening and welcome to another edition of the Next Man Up podcast, brought to you by Press Play Podcast Network and producer extraordinaire Chase Smith. I'm Dennis Maniloff. We'll be joined momentarily by co-host Kenny Rhoda. I'm starting from behind, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, because the Roadman, I hear, had a star-studded guest appearance on Orange is Oranger with our good buddy Jeremy, and the numbers were phenomenal. And, of course, Roadman talked about the Myles Garrett situation. Who hasn't talked about it? But I deliberately did not listen to Orange is Oranger because I wanted, in this podcast, to have a fresh perspective and wanted to know what Roadman was thinking without having a preconceived notion. So, Kenny, let me start with you. And I get that it was last Thursday, but we haven't had a chance on this podcast, on the Next Man Up podcast, to weigh in together about what went down. Just give me your thoughts about what you were thinking when you were thinking. Give me your thoughts about in the immediate aftermath as you saw it unfold Thursday night at the end of the game.
That's a good term to use, aftermath, D-Man, because that's exactly what it was, man. And here it is. We're taping this on a Tuesday night. We're not the only ones still talking about it, D-Man. It's everywhere. Saturday Night Live in their opening skit had Kenan Thompson play Myles Garrett in the opening skit holding a Steelers helmet. O.J. Simpson, Orenthal James Simpson is talking about it on Twitter. So this is something that everybody is still discussing at the water cooler, on the national shows, on the local shows. And here's, to sum it up, here's the way I look at it. Myles Garrett lost his mind, freaked out. I used the term cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs for whatever reason, and swung a helmet at Mason Rudolph. That's wrong. It can't happen. He deserves whatever suspension he gets. Pouncey deserves the 3 games. I thought he should have got 4 games personally. He deserves the 3 games for kicking a guy in the helmet. That 2 wrongs don't make a right. I also think that Ogunjobi just comes out of nowhere and shoves Rudolph, who doesn't have his helmet on. He deserves the 1 game there. But Rudolph is not innocent in all of this. He started it all with trying to rip the helmet off of Myles Garrett. Then he kicked him in the groin twice. And then he, after kind of settled down, he went after Myles Garrett again, and he doesn't get a suspension. And I heard Mike Tomlin today say, well, we didn't do anything wrong to start the, and I'm just thinking that's a bunch of BS. Mike Tomlin, I don't know if he's trying to protect, the players because the appeals haven't officially been heard or what, but that's hogwash, man. So Rudolph should have got a game, but if you're a Browns fan, D-Man, you don't want him suspended for a game or 2 games. He sucked. He was terrible. He threw 4 picks, was sacked 4 times. You want him playing in the next Browns-Steelers game so you can beat the Steelers again. So he should have been suspended. He wasn't. Garrett deserves what he gets, and I'm curious to see if the league reduces any of the suspensions. That's where I'm at right now.
Yeah, and Roadman speaks of the appeals that were scheduled in New York. All 3 players were supposed to appeal, Ogunjobi, Pouncey, and Myles. We know for sure that Myles Garrett's is tomorrow because we're taping Tuesday night. His appeal is Wednesday. So, if you're listening to this late Wednesday, we don't know yet. You'll know, but we won't know at this point what the result of the appeal is. There have been rumors that Pouncey's is already done, but we couldn't find anything before we started this podcast. So maybe he goes tomorrow. But here's how I viewed it. And by the way, I was on the post-game show on WTAM 1100 when this went down. We were essentially watching it live because the post-game show had started with 10 minutes left in the fourth quarter by virtue of a scheduled time slot.
Right.
And so we were watching this unfold in real time, and certainly in disbelief. And I'm actually glad I'm talking to you now, Roadman, as opposed to right after the game, because I have had a chance to take in the endless coverage, the incredible amount of written and spoken word that has been devoted to this. And when I saw it live, of course, I thought it was, a reprehensible act by Myles Garrett. You certainly cannot use a helmet as a weapon in any way, shape, or form. You can't swing it uh, in anybody's direction, let alone hitting a guy in the head. So, first and foremost, Myles Garrett, as you said, Kenny, lost his mind, blacked out, whatever you want to call it. And he is responsible for a very bad action on the field and deserves to be punished severely for it. But as I listened to the coverage that night and then on into Friday, I'm sitting there going, I think it's over the top in this sense. Yes, Myles Garrett is to blame. He is the most culpable in this scenario, but he is not a goon. This is not some, absolute worst of the worst. I mean, the way people were portraying this, you would think Myles Garrett was the most vicious, nastiest, worst player in the history of the NFL who had committed these criminal acts on the field. And I thought it was over the top then, and I even more so now think it's over the top to have portrayed Garrett in such a negative light. Now, having said that, if Garrett had swung the closed end portion of the helmet, the crown, and the crown had hit Rudolph and knocked him silly and he'd been concussed or even worse, then of course I wouldn't be saying this. But the fact of the matter is he swung the open-ended part of the helmet. Rudolph was not injured, and therefore I don't think you have to drag on the idea that Myles Garrett should potentially have this follow him for the rest of his career.
Yeah, but D-Man, think about this. I mean, let's just, I mean, it doesn't matter that he didn't use that portion of the helmet and hit him square in the head. The intent was there. Forget about whether he hit him or not. The intent was there. And yes, he's lucky he didn't land it squarely, in the middle of his head with the not the padded portion of the helmet. Okay, the intent was there. It's like, if you're in a crime and let's say, you have a knife in your hand and you go and you swing the knife at somebody to try and stab them, you miss them, but the intent was to try and stab them. I mean, yes, he's lucky he didn't, but the intent was there. That's why I think this is such an egregious act and why Roger Goodell and the NFL is coming down so hard on him.
Well, here's what I say to that, though. We deal in real life, and then certainly in the toy department of sports, in what actually happened versus what is perceived to have happened. And there are many, many plays on the football field that are vicious, illegal, cheap shot plays that could potentially either concuss someone or worse, paralyze them. If the spine is crunched in the wrong way. We've seen it many, many times over the years, and we don't remember 90% of them because the result was the player did not go to the hospital. The player did not get concussed. The player did not suffer paralysis or anything of that sort at the hands of a cheap shot. There are plenty of cheap shots that occur in the NFL that the delivering player does not have to carry around with him for the rest of his career.
But name me one where a guy took somebody's helmet off and swung it at the guy who didn't have a helmet on and almost hit him. Name me one in that situation.
I can't. But here's the thing, though. I'm not excusing it. I don't, that gets misconstrued. I'm not, excusing what Garrett did. I'm not saying he shouldn't be punished for many games. I think realistically it should be the end of the regular season. I think the appeal is ultimately going to be where he is going to be able to say that the suspension ends at the end of the regular season.
Okay.
I'm thinking the appeal part is going to get him out of the reinstatement process. That's my guess.
All right.
Okay. But even if I'm wrong there, okay, so he potentially has to get reinstated or apply for reinstatement. Maybe he sits another 4 games to start 2020. I'm saying that I don't see why in the year 2025, Myles Garrett has to carry around with him this scarlet letter that I was the guy who swung the helmet, because the result was the guy he hit was okay. Not excusing the action at all. He served his punishment. He will have served his punishment. He will have done all his community service and all his repentance. But he doesn't have to sit there and go, I will always be remembered as the guy who swung the helmet. That, I think, is unfair.
That is up to him and what he does from this point forward and how he handles it. Okay. If he's remorseful in his meeting with Roger Goodell, who's the judge, jury, and executioner and always is, whether that's fair or not in the NFL, how remorseful is he? What does he do once he leaves the offices in New York and comes back in the community for the rest of this year and next year, should the suspension carry over? I think it's up to Myles Garrett how he acts from this point forward. Do I think he's going to be a repeat offender like Antonio Callaway was, right? And what we say, D-Man, after the last podcast we did, wait till the next morning to see if he gets suspended. And sure enough, it was 10 games, right? So I don't think he's going to be a repeat offender like Antonio Callaway. I'm not saying with, the substance abuse or anything like that. I'm just saying in this case, it's the act on the field of him being like an Ndamukong Suh or a Vontaze Burfict. He needs to make sure he's not. How does he handle that moving forward? Could he be forgiven about this? Probably. Joe Green kicked a guy in the groin. Joe Green took a football or a helmet and threw it, into the stands or whatever it was, into the sidelines, and he's in the Hall of Fame. And people don't always point to that, even though it's brought up on occasion. It's up to Myles Garrett what he does from this point forward to make people kind of forget about what he did in this situation.
There's no doubt about it. And yeah, I agree with you there, Kenny, of course. And I'm just thinking of, I'm thinking of all the cheap shots that I've seen in the NFL.
Right.
Delivered with the crowns of the helmets toward a guy who obviously has a helmet. I'm not saying, that it's a cheap shot where a guy with a helmet hits a guy who doesn't have a helmet. But, those cheap shots get tossed into the dustbin of history because nobody, thank God, wasn't severely, or nobody was severely injured there.
Okay.
So I hope, all right, let me just amend it. I hope that history will be kind to Garrett if, in fact, he does change, and this never happens again. I mean, he never has this incident again. I hope history will be kind enough to not have to remind him every second of every day that he was the guy who swung the helmet at Rudolph. Now, I want to go back to the play. Certainly Myles is 99% to blame. I think that, it's just my gut. I've never spoken to Myles about it, and I don't know this is just my opinion.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if Garrett thought that he had a sack. I'm wondering if he thought that Rudolph had gotten rid of it, and he was going to get the sack at the end of the game, which was a blatant stat pad, if in fact it was his intention. Now, if you asked him directly, he would probably deny it, say He wasn't trying to get the stat padding sack. But I wish my thought on that was wrong, but I can't get it out of my head that he was just trying to get, because why else would you wrap the guy up in that situation?
I agree. You're not the only one thinking that way, D-Man. Go ahead. I'm with you.
I hope I'm wrong, but I don't think I am. So he starts it by the unnecessary attempt at a sack, or taking him down with both arms wrapped around him.
Right.
But then Rudolph definitely exacerbates the situation by grabbing Myles' helmet and turning it even the slightest bit. I can't even imagine what it's like to be an NFL player. I certainly can't imagine what it's like to be an NFL player on the ground in the heat of battle and have your helmet start to get pulled off. Maybe that prompts a, I wouldn't say a panic attack, but maybe that prompts something in Myles where he snaps because he feels like somebody's trying to pull his head off or something to that effect. So
right.
There's no way in the world that Rudolph was innocent in this. And then the other thing that Rudolph did, I know the kick in the groin or whatever you want to say about that, but to me, once Myles Garrett has taken your helmet off, if you're Mason Rudolph, the last thing you're going to do is charge at him. Again, I can't stress this enough, especially to the kiddos. I'm not excusing what Myles Garrett did. I'm simply saying that Rudolph did not need to run around the Steelers' offensive lineman and charge at Myles like a tough guy while Myles was holding his helmet and he was helmetless. That didn't make any sense to me. So Rudolph is far from the choir boy here. I think he deserved a game. I think the Ogunjobi suspension was about right because he not only swung with his fists, he tried to kick. The one kick attempt was blocked, but he still tried to do it. So he deserves to get suspended. The Garrett suspended indefinitely. I'm good with that until we find out about the appeal. So by and large, I agree with what was happening. And here's the thing. The NFL, Roger Goodell and his crew, they had really no choice but to come down incredibly hard on Myles Garrett because of what Kenny was mentioning and what I believe to be true as well. You've got to send the message to the entire league that you can never, ever feel like it is even 0.1% acceptable to take off a helmet and swing it. You can never let that happen in your game. So if Goodell had suspended Garrett for, let's say, 4 games, then somebody goes, oh, that's all he got for hitting a guy with a helmet?
Right.
All right, next time I get in a fit of rage, I'm going to feel like I can swing a helmet, and the worst that's going to happen to me is I lose 4 games. So you have to legislate that out of your game as best you can with a sizable punishment. So I don't agree with Browns fans who say, oh, it's too heavy, it's too harsh. No, it's not too harsh, as long as he has a chance to come back in 2020 with a relatively clean slate.
If he's in the WWE, Vince McMahon's applauding him, right? If he's in the MMA fight, Dana White's applauding him. You can't do this in the NFL. And, the problem with him and why he's going to get hit with maybe the most extensive suspension for an act on the football field is because of this, D-Man. Don't forget, he's had 2 incidences already this year. The opener against the Titans, and then he knocked the Jets quarterback out with a late hit, and this is the 3rd one in 1 season. I talked with somebody who I value their opinion, okay? And the knock supposedly on Myles coming into this season, for whatever reason, was he's not a tough guy. He's not tough enough. He needs to toughen up. I don't know if he was trying to, be that tough guy with those earlier penalties. And then this also to prove a point to show the NFL that, hey, I'm a tough guy. I'm Hercules, but I'm also, you don't want to mess with me. I'm not sure, but this is uncharacteristic of him prior to this season. So
Well,
I want to know, and he won't answer this and hasn't answered it, D-Man, what was said or what triggered him to react the way he did. He hasn't answered that and refuses to. And maybe after the appeal is heard and then the final suspensions are given, maybe he will respond that way, because I want to know what that was. That's me as a reporter, who, what, where, when, why, and how. What triggered him?
Yeah, Roadman, and you mentioned something just now that I wanted to expand on anyway, and that is you talked about how Myles might have been, shall we say, goaded into being a tough guy this year when he heard the chirps about how he's the mild-mannered assassin, the mild-mannered jazz-playing, dinosaur-loving, dog-loving guy, and maybe he needs to have a meaner streak. So he's going out there and he's overcompensating for what's not really in his DNA. I mean, he could be an effective football player, but he doesn't have to be an animal out there. And maybe Garrett thought, you know what, I got to show these people that I have a mean streak. But it's not just Garrett, and that's what I wanted to ask you as part 2 of this pod.
All right.
The Browns' attitude in general, clearly against the Steelers, the Browns were trying to show that they were tough guys. And the Steelers acknowledged as such, the word coming out of the Steelers camp that the Browns were trying to be the bullies on Thursday night.
Right.
And you saw, a couple of ejections there, and you saw some helmet-to-helmet stuff and whatnot. So I ask you this, was the Steelers game an example of, and we don't know, exactly what was said to these players going into the game, but would you think that perhaps the Steelers game was a case where the players were told by the coach or the coaching staff, hey, we want you guys to establish your place on the block, your physicality and everything else. And the Browns said, all right, we're going to go out and not be thugs, but extra physicality. Do you think that might have come from the coaching staff?
I hope it didn't, D-Man, because then we're talking Sean Payton and Greg Williams, right? We're going back to what happened.
And by the way, let me just say this again. And I'm not talking about the Myles Garrett thing. In no way, shape, or form am I ever suggesting that the coaching staff would ever condone that. No, I'm talking about, would the coaching staff have given the Browns a directive to get, quote, physical out there to the point where the Steelers know you're there and the players take that and go, all right, well, that means we got to start getting we need to not only get up to the line, we need to go over it sometimes.
Yeah, I hope that wasn't the case. I don't think that was the case. Maybe the players took it upon themselves because of what they've been hearing and the way the Steelers have owned them. They were 0-7-1 prior to this game in the last 8 meetings with the Pittsburgh Steelers. And you go back in the last, I think it's 41 or 42 games, the Steelers had won 35 times, some ridiculous number, right? So you want to send a message, but, you had, who was it? Juju Smith-Schuster out with a concussion. Deontay Johnson went out with a concussion, bleeding from his ear. Demarius Randall thrown out of the game, and deservedly so for that targeting and helmet-to-helmet hit. So, maybe the players took it upon themselves to say, all right, we're going to be extra physical, and they crossed the line. Whether it came from the coaching staff, I find that hard to believe after what happened with New Orleans. Sean Payton suspended for a year, Greg Williams suspended. I can't imagine the coaches would say that, but maybe the players took it upon themselves, D-Man, to try and be extra physical and be the bullies on the block that the Steelers used to be with James Harrison and Hines Ward.
Well, I'm glad you said that, Roadman, because in the aftermath of the game, and, as people were not only commenting on the Garrett situation, but also, as you mentioned, Randall and the rest of it, the overall physicality of the game, you were hearing that this was indicative of the Freddie Kitchens undisciplined Cleveland Browns. So I'm glad you said what you said, because given your answer, you're not inclined to say that what you saw Thursday night was because of Freddie Kitchens' lack of discipline. You're simply saying it was Browns players trying to ramp up the physicality intrinsically on their own, that they didn't need Freddie Kitchens to whip them into a frenzy. And I tend to agree with you, which means you and I are not assigning the blame that a lot of people were to Freddie Kitchens. Oh, just another example of how Freddie Kitchens has lost control of this team. I mean, people were trying to look. Freddie Kitchens has a lot of faults. I'll be surprised, honestly, if he's the coach of this team next year. I truly will. But I will never blame Freddie Kitchens for what Myles Garrett did.
Right.
But you had people in the immediate aftermath. Oh, this is an example of Freddie Kitchens letting anything go. Oh, what? What is that? How in the world do you assign Freddie Kitchens the blame for what Myles Garrett did? I thought that was absolutely foolish.
if you want to give him any blame, it's maybe in giving the players too much leeway or freedom and they took too much of it. You know what I mean? That then you could say, all right, well, Freddie didn't reel them in fast enough or strong enough. And so, yeah, maybe some of it goes on Freddie because, the lack of discipline throughout the entire season allowed these players to act on their own and step over the line. So, if you want to say it that way, okay, I'll give you that from Freddie's standpoint. But this was Demarius Randall going helmet to helmet. This was three Browns tackling Johnson and knocking him out of the game, and they weren't penalized on it, so no call was made. This was Myles Garrett at the end of the game with a late hit, but no flag was thrown. And I think that's why Rudolph reacted the way he did. I think that was either the second or third consecutive play where he had gotten hit, as he released the football. So there's a lot of blame to go around for the Browns being 4-6 through 10 games. Freddie, we've talked about that. His in-game decisions, his lack of discipline with the penalties, and he deserves a lot of it. Baker Mayfield, up until the last 3 games, was terrible, right? So there's a lot of blame to go around. Now, with it looks like Garrett out for the rest of the season, Ogunjobi at least for the Dolphins game, Morgan Burnett torn Achilles, right? I think Nelson. No, who's the safety that's out? I would keep on saying Nelson from the Chiefs, but he went to Pittsburgh. There's another safety that's out for the Browns. It's been out. Eric Murray, that's who it is. He's out too. So defensively, they're dinged up, D-man. Now, luckily for them, they play the Dolphins this week and Ryan Fitzpatrick at quarterback. They should be able to beat the Dolphins by 3 touchdowns without all those guys I just mentioned. But it's time for the offense to pick up the defense in the absence. Olivier Vernon hurt, Ogunjobi suspended, Garrett suspended. It's time for that offense to do what we all expected them to do from week 1 and be the bell cow, be the reason why this team wins football games.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the offense, Roadman, because that's where I was going next. Overshadowed, and by overshadowed, we mean a blimp-sized shadow that was, happened on Thursday night. A quality performance from the Bake Show. Baker Mayfield did a really nice job against a defense that can cause all sorts of trouble, that loves to confuse and sack the quarterback and do all sorts of good things on the defensive side for a team. So Baker Mayfield played well, and nobody was talking about it. Chubb and another decent contribution from Hunt. So it was unfortunate that the incidents that occurred at the end of the game sort of glossed over
right
Mayfield's performance. But here's what I'm thinking. The Browns can beat the Dolphins, as you said, without a lot of their defensive pieces. Even if you have to win 41-31, you can do that. You can score on the Dolphins pretty much at will. And the Browns have healthy Mayfield, Beckham, Landry, Chubb, and Hunt. That should be enough to get you where you want to go against the Miami Dolphins. So that puts them at 5-6 and winners of 3 straight. Then you go to Pittsburgh, and I'm thinking, of course, it's a revenge game for the Steelers. They're going to be thinking about all that happened, blah, blah, blah. But the bottom line is, if the Browns win that game, then all of a sudden, all of the crap, for lack of a better term, that has taken place this year with the Cleveland Browns will almost be forgotten, because at that point you'd be 6-6, winners of 4 straight. And now you're looking at the rest of the schedule, and the Ravens stand out, but you feel like you can beat them even as hot as they are because you beat them in Baltimore. So is it possible that this team can go into Pittsburgh shorthanded defensively with at least Myles and Burnett out, and maybe Vernon? We think Ogunjobi would, of course he would be back, provided he drops his the appeal ends right then and there. So he would, if he has to serve one game, it would be the Dolphins. Do you think they could go into Pittsburgh and win that game and all of a sudden be a legitimate playoff contender instead of just a pipe dream.
You know how I've felt about the Steelers all season. I think they're a fraud. They did it with smoke and mirrors once they, went on that 4-game winning streak. You saw against a better team what that offense is. It's non-existent, D-man. If it wasn't for 53 yards of penalties against the Browns, they wouldn't have scored a touchdown in that game. They can't score. Connor hurt his shoulder again. They've got no running game. Juju Smith-Schuster's been hurt all season. He's a number 2, not a legitimate number 1. We're seeing that with no Antonio Brown to play off of. And Mason Rudolph's a fraud, an absolute fraud. So, yes, they can go in without Myles Garrett and still beat the Pittsburgh Steelers because they're a better football team on paper and on the football field. And they showed that the other night, and hopefully they can build off of that win, carry it over to Sunday against the Dolphins if you're a Browns fan, and into Pittsburgh for what is now a 1 o'clock kickoff instead of a 4:25 kickoff that Sunday in Pittsburgh. They are the better football team. Pittsburgh, Mike Tomlin, they're a fraud.
All right, so let me run this scenario at you.
Right.
The Browns, let's say they beat the Dolphins, lose to the Steelers, effectively ending their slim playoff hopes, and then lose another game, be it the Ravens or maybe at Arizona, because the Cardinals have been playing well and putting up a lot of points. But I'm saying for the purposes of this hypothetical, they lose no more than 2 games the rest of the way and finish 8-8 in Freddie Kitchens' first year as NFL head coach. Do you think that 8-8 and, as I said, a loss to the Steelers and a loss to either the Ravens or the Cardinals, meaning not losses to the Bengals, not embarrassing losses. Do you think an 8-8 under that scenario, under that hypothetical, would be enough to save Freddie Kitchens' job?
You mean like it saved Eric Mangini's job for an extra year, right? When then you pull the plug on him anyways because you were afraid to get rid of him because of the backlash you might hear because of what they did down the stretch. For me, this team needs to finish 9-7 for Freddie to keep his job. 8 wins is a half game better than last year, D-man, and that's not enough improvement for me with what they've had on paper and all the question marks surrounding Freddie Kitchens and the Mike McCarthy that is out there, and who knows who else might be out there available for the Browns to go after. I don't know what you were told. I was told Mike McCarthy was a guy they were interested in, but they wanted him to take Freddie as his offensive coordinator, and he said, no, thank you. If I'm going to be the head coach, I've got to be able to bring in my guys, and that's why he didn't take the job. So for me, this team, I believe they've got to go 9-7, 10-6, and make the playoffs in order for Freddie to keep his job. I think we've seen enough of Freddie to realize that he is not ready to be a head coach for a team that is expected to win now, D-man. If this were a completely rebuilding team, where maybe it's 2 or 3 years down the road where you expect to make the playoffs, okay, let him grow with the team. To win now, this year, failed. To win next year, I'm not sold on him to be able to do that next year. Unless he makes the playoffs and shows that he can rally the team and get there, or at least finish 9-7, I don't think at 8-8 you keep him.
Yeah, and listen, there are wise men and wise women as they analyze the NFL who have said you cycle through quarterbacks and head coaches until you find the right one. In other words, I know Parcells famously did it with quarterbacks. I don't know if this was exactly his philosophy with with coaches, but I would assume that it was. You just keep rifling through them until you find the right one, even if it means you have to look bad in an instance where it's only a year. And I'm not saying that it's so extreme that you cut a guy after 4 games, but at the end of a season, if you're John Dorsey and you don't feel right as you wake up in the morning and look in the mirror about your team, and you don't feel right that Freddie Kitchens is the guy for you, then you cut him loose. You don't sit there and go, well, I'll see how it goes for another year. Maybe he'll grow, from his growing pains, or he'll get better from his growing pains. If in his gut, John Dorsey says this is not the right fit, then you move on to the next guy. Just as if you were to look at Baker Mayfield someday, hopefully way down the road for Browns fans' sake, you look at him and you go, you know what? He's not the right guy for me. I want somebody else. You don't get stuck on the name or the draft status or the amount of years that you supposedly committed to a coach or how you felt about that coach. You know, when you first hired him, look at the problem of Hugh Jackson. Jackson was here too long, in part because of, there's no way we can't give Jackson another chance because look at what we thought about him when we hired him. No, you can't use that as your rationale to keep a guy. So I think Freddie has the year. I'm with you. I think 9-7 or 10-6 if they look good doing it. You know, it's a very good chance that Kitchens does retain his job because presumably the Browns will be playing hard for him and they will have shown improvement in a lot of areas. But the problem is if you're Dorsey and you're even on the fence about it, you cut Kitchens loose. It's like you can't say to Kitchens, well, we really like you as a play caller, but we're cutting you loose as a head coach. We're going to try to attach you to the next head coach because, as you said, didn't work with McCarthy. It's probably not going to work with the next head coach anyway. You're not going to be able to say, well, we got Freddie here waiting to reunite and recalibrate with his buddy Baker, but you come in here and you inherit Freddie. No, that's unfair to the head coach, the new one. So Kitchens would have to go if you were to cut him loose. He's not going to stick around just because he had good chemistry with Baker in the second half of 2018.
And D-Man, what was he known for? His play calling. The fact that he sucked at that for the first 10 games is a fireable offense right there. That if anything, if they were doing great on offense and the defense was bad and they were losing games, then you say, hey, look, Freddie, what's his forte? Calling plays. The offense is fine. Give them another year, fix the defense, they'll be fine. It's the exact opposite. They have Odell Beckham Jr., okay? Freaking OBJ. He has one more touchdown than you and I do this year in the NFL. How is that possible when Michael Thomas in New Orleans, everybody knows that Drew Brees is going to throw him the football. And guess what? He still gets open and is having a record-setting year. And they can't get OBJ the football in the end zone and score touchdowns. That, to me, is on the play caller, and that's on Freddie Kitchens.
Yeah, and assuming this year doesn't end in a playoff, and I hope it does, but the odds are long. Assuming that it doesn't, I think that ultimately the mistake that was made, in addition, if they admit to move on from Kitchens, is the Monken-Kitchens marriage just never made sense because, to me, if you're Freddie Kitchens, and I don't know who was advocating or who was banging the drum for Monken, if it was Kitchens or if it was Dorsey or one of Dorsey's guys, but they had to have known relatively early that the offensive philosophy of Todd Monken does not quite synchronize with the offensive philosophy of Freddie Kitchens. There's no harm there. There's no animosity. It's just that two guys coming from a different perspective, both, offensive brains, no doubt about it. I mean, we could sit in the room with Monken and Kitchens for 10 hours and not teach them a thing about football. They're both very bright offensive minds, but there are plenty of different offensive philosophies in the NFL. And just because you have one bright guy in Monken and another bright guy in Kitchens doesn't mean that they're going to create a good partnership. So when we heard those reports in spring, I keep going back to that, the preseason, when the national reports were coming out, that Kitchens and Monken were not seeing eye to eye in terms of offensive implementations. We were kind of blowing that off and, no big deal. They'll be fine. They'll be fine. They said they'll be fine. But there was obviously truth to that. And I think it could ultimately be the undoing of Freddie Kitchens, because if Kitchens would have brought in somebody that was simpatico with him and his philosophies, then he could have recognized in 3, 4, or 5 games that this is too much for him at the moment, and he could have offloaded the play calling to a guy that he's got the same wavelength with, and then you wouldn't have this crisis where Kitchens doesn't feel like he can offload it to Monken because they're on different pages. That's how I'm seeing it. So if you had somebody who was more in tune with Kitchens, who Kitchens felt like, fit him like a glove, he would not be afraid to offload the play calling because he was drowning in his first year as an NFL head coach.
D-Man, this marriage between Monken and Kitchens is worse than Kim Kardashian and Chris Humphries, which lasted 72 hours. How it's lasted this long is beyond me. Why they haven't split, divorced, went their separate ways is beyond me. Maybe it's because Monken doesn't want to quit. He'll lose the paycheck. If he gets fired, he gets to keep the paycheck. I'm not sure, but I know he ain't happy, but he ain't giving up the money, I guess. So something has to be done either with the head coach, or if you want to keep Freddie, Monken ain't coming back next year. You got to go in a different direction.
I'll tell you this, Roadman. I think Monken also wants to be the last man standing of the two.
Maybe.
I mean, he's like, you know what? I'm not to blame here. It's not my problem. So I don't want to bail voluntarily and have this guy still standing when I'm out the door. But, no matter what those guys say, clearly the offense suffered because the OC and the head coach were not on the same wavelength. And as I said before, it's not that I'm saying they're fighting each other or they stare daggers into each other. If he weren't calling plays, he maybe would have had more time to spend on making sure his players were executing plays on both sides of the ball without jumping off sides or committing false starts. Maybe his teams would be more disciplined if he didn't have to worry about calling plays all the time. So it's really unfortunate how that has occurred, and it essentially has been part of the sabotaging of the Browns season in 2019.
Yeah, no doubt, D-Man. So, hey, let's see what happens this week. I think they'll beat the Dolphins by 3 touchdowns. If they don't, dare I say they lose this game, Freddie may not make it out of the stadium with a job on Sunday if they lose to the Dolphins after that. Now, they come out and they win by, if they just win, forget by 3 touchdowns, they win. That's 3 in a row. Then they go into Pittsburgh and win. That's 4 in a row, right? And then you got the bank, so there's a chance for him to save his job. It's there in front of him. Let's see if the players rise up and answer the call as well for Freddie, for themselves.
That's a great point, because we know that players, and I don't blame them, players play for themselves and their families and their teammates. I don't blame them one bit, because professional sports, especially in the NFL, is cutthroat, and the teams don't care about you. When you're injured or whatnot, they'll cut you in a blink. So I don't blame these players for going, looking inward before they do anything else. That said, it is a fascinating dynamic, because the players can say, you know what, if we go all out and we give it everything we have and we pay attention to detail and we practice hard, then we're possibly saving Freddie Kitchens' job in the process. So, and the question is, do they like him enough to want to save him? And I'm not saying if they don't like him, they're going to tank and just, take plays off and make sure they lose. But if you really like a coach, you'll run through the proverbial wall for him, and you'll pay more attention to detail, and you'll really want to, bear down on everything the coach asks you to do. We'll see if that's the threshold with Freddie Kitchens.
Absolutely. I'm with you 100% on that. And I'll be curious how about this, D-Man, on the Kenny and JT show today, WHBC 1480, shameless plug. You can check it out Monday through Friday, 3 to 7, WHBC.com, live on the internet. We put a poll out. What's the biggest game this weekend, football-wise, that you're going to watch? At the time of the show, I think we had over 500 votes on it. So not a bad sampling, right? 500. We gave them 3 choices. Massillon Tigers versus the Hoban Knights D2 Regional Championship, which is a rematch of the state championship game from a year ago. Ohio State, Penn State. Ohio State wins, they guarantee themselves a spot in the Big Ten championship game, right? Or Browns Dolphins. Buckeyes were 1, Hoban Maslin was 2, and the Browns were 3 this weekend. How about that? I don't know what that says about the Browns fans, if they're not believing in this team or if they're pissed off I'm not sure. But this is a Browns town. And I know maybe it was skewed a little bit because I'm in Stark County doing the show. But I threw it out there and I tagged everybody, however you tag that crap on Twitter with the Twitches and all that. And the Browns were 3rd in the most important game this weekend. So they need to win this game Sunday, beat Pittsburgh again without any hullabaloo and circumstances afterwards, I think, to get some of these fans back believing in them.
Well, I'm not going to go to the extreme that you just did, Kenny. I'm going to pin 90% of the apathy on the Dolphins, on the opponent. I think the Browns fans think that this is going to be a win, and therefore they're not as enthused about it. I think you'll see plenty of enthusiasm a week from Sunday, provided the Browns beat the Dolphins when the Browns head into Pittsburgh. I will say I did see your poll. And I had one I wanted to add, but I know you were writing to your audience. Yeah. I'm going to be the color analyst alongside Dave DiNatale, a friend of yours.
Dino!
WKYC.com, high school game of the week at Byers Field in Parma as the mighty Menor Cardinals face the St. Edward Eagles. So that is an epic showdown between two superpowers. And I'm excited to have gotten the call to be the analyst. This will be my 4th game with Dino, but
you're a lucky man. You're getting that game and you get to do it with Dino. We did games together back in the day at KNR. Dino's fantastic. He's a great producer, but an even better play-by-play guy, in my opinion. So you guys do have a great one there. And I think the winner of that game wins the state title this year, D-Man. And I know Mentor wants to do it for Coach Triv in his final year as the head coach up there in Mentor.
I agree with you. Roadman, final thing. I would be remiss if I didn't ask you this.
Yep.
Are the Ravens as unstoppable as they appear at this point? And, I mean, what in the world is going on with that team since the Browns defeated them in Baltimore? They look like they're the closest thing to an unstoppable force that I can think of in the NFL. Is it a case where Jackson is just that good, or do you expect the Ravens to come back to earth someday?
You haven't seen this combination, right, of a quarterback who's not afraid to run, is accurate this year. He wasn't last year. Let me rephrase that. Is more accurate this year than he was last year. And has a defense where if he makes a mistake, it doesn't hurt him as much, right? So the league hasn't seen this yet. They're still adjusting to what Ozzie, and there he goes again, in his final draft as the general manager of the Baltimore Ravens, Ozzie Newsome takes him with the final pick of the 1st round. This is a team right now that is playing as well as anybody in the league, D-Man. I still, if you're giving me them against the Patriots in the AFC Championship game, I'm taking Belichick. I'm taking Brady. But are they the best team in the AFC to maybe knock off the Patriots that have the best chance? Yeah. So I'm not sure what happened, what flipped or what switch was flipped after the Browns embarrassed them at home, but it's working right now and teams haven't adjusted to it. And I'm wrong because I expected them to go in the opposite direction with Lamar Jackson. He's exceeded my expectations, and I'm putting some Famous Dave's barbecue sauce and Old Carolina barbecue sauce on that crow that I'm going to have for dinner maybe at the end of the season because of the Ravens.
Yeah, it just makes you scratch your head that whoop-de-hell went into Baltimore and punked the Ravens. Lamar was healthy. Ingram was healthy. Most of their roster was healthy. And Freddie and the boys at 1-2 going into the game just smoked them. It wasn't even as close as 40-25.
Right.
They got the garbage time touchdown at the end. It should have been 40-17 or 40-18 because they went with 7 total there. But I mean, just that game just is such an amazing 3 hours of football. And to think that it was, Freddie Kitchens and the crew, and now that you see what's happened to the Ravens since, it becomes all the more remarkable to ponder that afternoon when we thought that the AFC North mantle was being, handed to the Browns, and instead the Ravens decide, you know what, we're so upset with this loss, we're not going to lose again.
Right.
Meanwhile, the Browns are embroiled in controversy. So
they're going to get a bye. They're the number 2 seed. They've got a 3-game lead in the division. Stick a fork in the Steelers, the Browns, and the Bengals. As far as the division goes, that baby's, turn out the lights, the party's over.
Yeah.
Dandy Don used to sing that. Well, it is in the AFC North.
And they're so good right now, they're forcing Belichick to win. He's got to win every week. He can't rely on the patty cake AFC East to cruise into the number 1 or, spot for sure. Playoffs go through us, or at least, up until the Super Bowl. So Belichick has to win, and he got hammered. The same team that got embarrassed by the Browns turned around a few weeks later and smoked Belichick. So it just shows you how crazy the NFL can be. But it also is a case where, we try to be fair here. You credit where credit is due. You credit the Browns on that afternoon for a phenomenal performance.
Let's see what they do the next 2 weeks, though, before we crown them the best team in the AFC. They've got the Rams on the road this week, and then the 49ers at home. So let's see what those 2 teams, do against the Ravens. And then it's the Bills on the road. So actually 3 decent games, right, in a row down the stretch. But they have such a big lead, they're not going to lose the division.
Well, Roadman, thank you very much for taking the time. Thank you for, talking again about Myles, even though you had already done that several times. I appreciated it, hearing it from you.
Hey, man, family first, D-man. You were away on the weekend. Family first. Anytime, anywhere, family is first, and everything else is second. That's the way I feel. So, everybody else is still talking about it. Why not us?
All right. Thanks, everybody, for listening, and we'll talk to you soon.